This is one of the stories that is almost like an urban myth, that your brain starts to make new connections in the psychedelics. My initial inclination to search in psychedelic retreats was very much also inspired by looking for what I've lost in my childhood, or what I found in my childhood, but what I lost when I grew up. The comforting aspects of the rituals, the music, and some kind of shamanistic belief system that is presented to you that can also provide a strong direction of meaning and purpose.
So it feels rather iconic to be speaking with Michiel van Elk today. Michiel is known for his sober outlook on psychedelics, but given the latest political elections in the Netherlands, the outlook on psychedelics just may have gone from sober to somber. Michiel, the PVV won the elections, and for the English speakers in the audience, PVV stands for the Partij voor de Vrijheid, the Party of Freedom. Some people, given the historical ethos of this party, call it the Partij voor de Verboden, so the party of the forbidding. How are you looking at the latest elections? And I heard you in your one of your discourses mentioning that you had a prognosis that psychedelics would be regulated within 4 to 5 years. Has that prognosis changed now?
Well, first off, I share, of course, a general feeling of disappointment for the victory of PVV and everything that I hold dear in terms of policy aimed towards preventing climate change, fostering higher education, culture. European Union is what the PVV does not stand for. And I was also very much concerned about the drug policy, indeed, because they're known to have a very conservative tendency. So I was actually expecting that they would advocate more prohibition, reducing the availability of, for instance, magic mushrooms. But when I looked into a couple of discussions yesterday, I wasn't too sure if that's actually the case, because it seems they want to primarily target criminality around drug use and are actually aiming for regulation instead of prohibition. So
there's an anecdotal story about Luis Bontes, who is a former PVV member, and he was very adamant about certain entheogens. And specifically, he mentioned salvia, and there's anecdotal stories that he was saying that, well, salvia is even worse than psychedelic mushrooms, and we must forbid it all. Well, he was eventually let go of in 2013, but yet that kind of sets the tone of voice for how this party looks at certain progressive middle or certain progressive entheogens.
Yeah, definitely. But to be honest, salvia is actually quite a powerful experience. And it's actually quite strange if you think about it, that salvia is indeed legal, while MDMA, which is a much more moderate and mild experience, is illegal. So there's something very illogical about the drug policy making that should maybe be reconsidered.
There's lots of illogical things with respect to the drug policies, and yes, absolutely, it should be reconsidered. And we were hoping for a more liberal party in order to do that. But let's see, maybe you're right. Maybe regulation requires some kind of typical type of thinking, and maybe this is exactly what we needed. But I don't know, my outlook is not so positive.
No, I agree. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you feel this will have any specific implications with respect to the budgets and the subsidies that are allocated to studies and research? Because let's be honest, we're a little bit behind on these topics compared to some of other countries.
Yeah, definitely. We were very hopeful over the past 2 years with the Prime Minister or the Minister Ernst Kuipers of Health, because he clearly was interested in psychedelic therapy and application of psychedelics in mental health institutions. But with the current political wave of right-wing conservatism, everyone is concerned that there will be budget cuts in general for scientific research and in higher education. And also that indeed integrating psychedelic therapy and mental health care is not a priority for them at all. But they will be more looking at like fostering existing therapies and investing in those.
Well, let's hope that this improves. And because, well, actually the intention of this podcast, so what I would like to do, obviously we can go in so many different directions, And there's so much material already available from you that is wonderful. And I recommend everybody to listen to your discourses or read your books. It's just a wealth of information. And I was thinking, I would like to leave our listeners with something tangible or something practical that they can go to or use, perhaps even something like a modus operandi for a psychedelic journey. And I thought, well, given your work and expertise and my passion, so your neuroscientific work and my passion for Jungian psychology, wouldn't it be cool if we together could co-create some kind of operating manual or a Google Maps for navigating a psychedelic experience, which immediately brings up the concept of agency. Do you think it's possible to have agency over altered states?
No, I think actually agency goes, in my view, counter to the psychedelic experience. I think key to having a good psychedelic experience, if anything like that even exists, is the ability to surrender and let go instead of feeling of agency. I mean, people can definitely learn to navigate challenging experiences through meditation, through body work, breathing, dance exercises, etc. But at the same time, I think the key component of being able to work with psychedelics is the ability to surrender to the process and to let go of control. And I think many of the challenging experiences actually happen when people are too much in their agency and want to gain control over something that is, by definition, uncontrollable.
I'm curious how this will evolve, because there's different streams of thoughts with respect to agency. And for example, Timothy Leary in Psychedelic Experience, he actually is trying to give people a tool and Timothy Leary is a scholar and kind of considered the psychedelic guru for the people who don't know him, giving people a tool or kind of specific guidelines or rating scales for, well, this is how the experience is progressing. Now you're finding yourself in your ego death. This is what you should do when you encounter the ego, and so forth. So that kind of gives the indication that there is a trend or a tendency to believe that it's possible to kind of have at least some kind of ability to manage a situation. And maybe that's what we need to differentiate, is like agency versus control. And maybe there's differences in that. And let's see how that works out as we progress through the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. But I would also, I'm very much, I like the idea of providing a kind of roadmap. But at the same time, I'm the last person in the world to actually call people to use psychedelics, because I think psychedelics are not for everyone.
Absolutely.
And if you look at the numbers, actually a very small group of people actually uses these substances. In the Netherlands, even though psilocybin truffles are legally available, it's only 3 to 5% who has a lifetime experience with these substances. And that number remains stable. So it's not the case that with the psychedelic revival, more and more people start using it. It's a really, really small group of people interested in these substances in the first place, and also a very weird group in a way. So people who are typically living in urban areas, more highly educated, are a bit younger, have score high on specific personality traits, such as openness to experience and risk-taking. So that already indicates that the people who use this already have a very specific profile that is difficult to generalize to the broader population. And I think that caveat is good to keep in mind. So it's not for everyone, and not many people are inclined to use it. But for those few people, definitely there are some best practices and guidelines around what we can say about responsible use of psychedelics.
I totally subscribe to that and agree that this is not about promoting psychedelics, but actually creating a little bit more awareness and education around this subject, also the benefits, but the risks associated too with it. And I like that you removed the stigma with respect to, for me, the category of people who is classically associated with psychedelics are the hippies, right? So then you see the dreadlocks, the typical type of archetype that is being associated with that.
Those still exist as well.
So I like to hear that it's a different stakeholder group. And let's face it, you and I, we fall into that stakeholder group as well. Well, I have half of my head shaven, so sometimes people may attribute certain qualities to that. Yeah, so you say 3%, and you're referring to psilocybin, so that's an interesting research. I am curious about, because I heard some research from the ICCRS, so don't ask me how to, Institute of something, where they spoke about ayahuasca having been consumed by already 4 million people in the year 2019. So that's 4 or 5 years ago. That's quite an impressive number at that moment in time. And then we're talking about things that go on record. Do we have statistics about things that are off record? And there's a lot happening off record, right?
Yes, of course. But in the Netherlands, we have the Nationale Drugsmonitor, the National Drug Monitor, that monitors the use of any type of legal or illegal substance. In Europe, you have the European Drugs Monitor, who also tries to provide data on that. And the main difference with the organization you just mentioned is that they don't have a representative sample. So they target people who are interested in psychedelics and in drug use. And those governmental agencies try to assess in the general population the use of different substances, including illegal substances. And of course, there might be some underreporting because some things happen underground. Yeah. But I think, still on those numbers, we have quite a good estimate of the prevalence of the use of these. Although hard numbers are difficult to get, indeed. But it's also true that there's actually a strong global interest in psychedelic retreats at the same time. But how that exactly takes shape is unclear. I was contacted by Booking.com earlier this week, the big agency for travel. And they did their own study among their travelers. And they made a prognosis for 2024. And they found that 14% of all people is interested in going on a psychedelic retreat. So that's actually quite a high number.
And they're choosing the Netherlands as the country to come for that.
Who knows? I mean, the Netherlands and Portugal are one of the few places in Europe where I think you can go on legal psychedelic retreats.
I heard you mention somewhere something related to 70 retreats in the Netherlands that are providing legal
psilocybin retreats. Yeah.
And what do we associate as legal? What is legal these days?
What is legal is if you buy magic truffles in the smart shop, the use of those truffles or the selling of those truffles is legal. Also, the consumption of those truffles is legal, but as soon as you process the truffles, like if you make tea of it, if you make a cookie out of it, then you're processing the psilocybin in the truffle, and the psilocybin is illegal. So it's one of those illogical things in the Dutch system that for instance, retreat organizers are not allowed to make tea that they serve to participants, but they are allowed to give people the psilocybin truffles, which are really difficult to eat and digest, but that's how they're allowed to work with these substances.
It's not referring, so the legal aspect is not referring to whether or not to the credentials of the specific people offering these psychedelic retreats.
No, only to the legal status. Like what they're doing is not illegal according to the Dutch laws, but there's no control whatsoever about whether they're qualified in terms of providing proper guidance or if they're licensed therapists or psychologists.
So this is interesting. So regulation then in that sense means that they will introduce certain qualification or control of qualification eventually for the facilitators themselves, meaning that they will empower a specific stakeholder group, and maybe the stakeholder group which is now active in this field, so the 70, might not fall into that category eventually with the regulation.
Yeah, the question is how that is being organized. I think some political parties are very much focused on imposing indeed a quality control, but at the same time, I'm much more in favor of self-organization of the system, because within the field, there's a lot of know-how about how to responsibly work with psilocybin truffles in this specific case. And I think if you would set up an organization that would impose some kind of standards, like these are the best practices that we identify, that would be a better way than some external governmental agency trying to come up with these rules, because they typically are far more distant from what happens in the field than the people working with these substances. And we already see that happening to a certain extent. In the Netherlands, there's the Guild of Guides. So this is an organization that is self-organized to try to establish the best practices for trip sitters, basically. There's also Stichting Liaan, which is trying to propose the best practices around the use of ayahuasca. And these are self-organized societies or organizations. And I think that could be a way to go, where you say, like, we want to do this together as a community rather than depending on some external agency that tells us how to do this.
And I like the lack of the top-down approach. So this is the grassroots. Let's come together.
Exactly.
We're passionate about this. We've done this before. We have the experience. We have the know-how. So let's together co-organize this rather than waiting for some party who may know the laws and the rules, but may not know the workings of the know-how of the psychedelics.
Yeah.
So we already gone so deep into the conversation, and yet every time we start a podcast, I try to introduce like a tradition, and that tradition is that we have a question from a previous participant or speaker that left a question for you. So I will ask that question now.
Okay, I'm curious.
That question is, what lights you up, Michiel?
Typically, my first response would be running. Going for a run always lights me up. So I try to implement this as a very regular habit, going for a short run 4 or 5 times a week. And it's really, for me, it's been a life changer. I started running, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. And it's really one of those things I found out that if I turn that knob, that it lifts my mood and it lights me up. And the rest of the day, I feel awesome. I feel great.
That's a great tip. And actually, I remember when I was suffering from my burnout, I was barely able to do anything. But the doctor said, so the Arbo Arts said, 20 minutes. If you can do 20 minutes per day of running, that would help you tremendously.
Yeah, or even less. Like if you're feeling not energized at all, but you can make it 5 minutes, start small, but you can build it up from there. Yeah.
Thank you. So I hope the previous speaker is satisfied with this answer. And I mentioned that I would like to create this modus operandi. Basically, kind of when thinking about the structure of this podcast, I was envisioning a specific framework. So I was thinking, well, how can we structure it in a way that is digestible and kind of brings people through a storyline or a narrative? And of course, then the hero's journey comes to mind, which is Joseph Campbell's framework. The hero's journey is made of 12 steps, and it is used in literature, so for writing narratives, for writing scripts, but also for developing cinematography, so like scripts and narratives for the movies. And it has been very, very popular among the Jungian analysts, and such one of them is Daryl Sharp. So he took this model and he adapted it to psychological transformations, looking at it with the Jungian lens. So this adapted model comprises 7 steps, so it's shorter, and it's specifically looking into the Jungian aspects and elements of psychological transformation, which I thought quite appropriate for a conversation of the nature that we're having. And it's maybe good to highlight why this specific model is so interesting, is because the Jungians believe that the core raison d'etre of a person is individuation. And individuation is actually the freeing of the ego consciousness from the deadly grip of the unconscious mind. In your discourse on neuroenchantment, you bring up the concept of the 9% versus the rest versus 91% or something of that kind when it comes to the conscious awareness versus unconscious awareness. I found that interesting because I think it's analogous to what we are describing here with the hero's journey. So then my question is, do you feel that there are parallels between, the raison d'etre as the Jungians view the individuation process for a person? Do you see the parallels between the conscious versus unconscious awareness in neuroscience?
I'm not really sure if I understand your question completely. Like you're referring to Jungian psychology?
Yeah.
And how I view that in contemporary science?
Exactly. So you speak about the 9% of our awareness being conscious and the remaining part being unconscious. Now, Jung believed that the hero's journey is our travel, so it's our individuation process. And individuation for him was about bringing into the conscious awareness that which we are unconscious of. And he said that it's not only important, it's not only like beneficial, but it is the core raison d'etre of our being. So it's like so critical that if we don't do this, we will typically end up being with maladaptive. So we would have symptoms such as, well, I don't know who I am in life, or a crisis, identity crisis, I think it's called, anxiety, depression, and so forth. So some of the symptoms of a male-adjusted individuation process, so a process that didn't go well. And in that sense, I kind of see the parallel between the neuroscience where we say, okay, 9% is conscious, the rest is unconscious. Jung says, well, the purpose of life is to bring more of the unconscious into consciousness, so making the dark light, so to speak. And I'm wondering, how does that relate with neuroscience? I mean, do you think there is a progressive or of an active need or demand on our brain to become more aware and to bring more of that unconscious part into the light?
Yeah, I don't know if I fully agree with this metaphor that you only use like only 9% of your brain processing is conscious. I think that's one of those urban myths that is not really grounded in proper neuroscience.
I took it from your TED talk, so
similar to I think I used it as maybe a brain myth as well. Like we know, of course, that there's implicit and unconscious processing, but at the same time, it's really difficult to put a label or a number on how much of it is actually unconscious. And in that sense, I don't know if the psychoanalysts were right to say that the majority of our processing is happening at an unconscious level, because we have the whole neocortex evolved for like self-reflection, self-awareness, conscious awareness, etc. So and we don't have those brain areas for nothing. I think they serve a purpose.
Obviously.
But what I can relate to is this idea of bringing the unconscious to the surface. And I think it's actually interesting if you closely look at the word psychedelic, that is actually a mind-revealing, it's basically a psychedelic, means the revelation of the human mind. And one of the early metaphors that was used by Stanislas Grof to exemplify what psychedelics are doing is that they amplify unconscious processes, and thereby they are able to reveal the mind in its truest essence. And a colleague of me, Aidan Lyon, he's a philosopher of mind. He has written a book about the psychedelic experience in which he exactly makes this point, that psychedelic experiences, broadly defined, so psychedelic experiences can be induced through the ingestion of a psychedelic, and thereby they reveal us something about who we are and about our things that are normally hidden below the surface. And I think there's some truth to that. He's also pointing out that psychedelics are not the only way of triggering those experiences. By meditation, you can have similar experiences that are mind-revealing and that you reveal something about our unconscious mind. But I don't know if neuroscience really has to add something to that picture.
I really was attracted to the idea of putting a number, the 9 to 91. So is it maybe helpful for the listeners to go through the 7 steps of the hero's journey that we're talking about? No, obviously, it's not a step-by-step kind of instruction, go left and then go right. And it's not necessarily that everybody will go through the same stages, but these are the typical type of stages that you could expect to encounter in both a psychological transformation and a psychedelic journey. So the first one is the call to adventure. This is when we speak about the motivation and the drive to, for example, engage in intelligence. The second step is meeting the mentor. Then we're going through crossing a specific threshold. Then we're encountering trials and challenges and ordeals. So we go through some kind of turbulation. Then there is the descent. This is where I would like to bring the subject of the ego death. And then we have the revelation and transformation. I think you speak of ontological shock. Maybe that's interesting to highlight in this part. And then we speak about return and integration, which is kind of obvious. So when it comes to, step number 1, let's say that's the call to adventure. And typically a call to adventure, people usually associate, I'm going to engage with psychedelics, or somebody's going to engage with psychedelics because they're going through some troublesome time. And that's true many times. Crisis is often considered a catalyst for growth. That's not no news. However, it's not necessarily always the case. So that's why I'd like to highlight also the other type of call to adventure, which is the creative calling. And in my case, this was the last psychedelic journey, which is just happened recently. I started to toy with the idea of doing a PhD degree in the field of psychedelics for obvious reasons. I'm talking about these subjects because of a personal experience which transformed my life 10 years ago. So I was catalyzed indeed for the first time into this field by a crisis situation. So at that time it was a mental crisis, depression, anxiety, and then burnout for years and years and years. And then thanks to Ibogaine, within 24 hours, all of those symptoms were erased. And I know I'm building a lot of hope and expectations here, but it actually is an anecdotal evidence of my personal experience. That's why I'm so explicit and loud about these topics. I'd like to share my experiences because I believe that they have power to help us. But then the latest experience, which was with psilocybin, was not a crisis situation, but was a creative process. So I thought I want to do a PhD degree because, given the fact that I'm Eastern European, I don't have any scientific background, who am I to talk about these topics? I don't really have the credibility card necessary for people to listen to these conversations. It's not that I need everybody to hear, but it would be nice to offer some kind of a ground or foundation. So, of course, like you say, you cannot be sober when you're looking at psychedelics, or can you really be sober when you're looking at psychedelics? I decided I'm going to ask the psilocybin, what can I study? So what would be an interesting path in PhD? And that was my latest call to adventure. In your book, you write that your call to adventure, so the first time you took ayahuasca, was the processing of a breakup with the mother of your children. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a nice metaphor indeed, and it fits well with the metaphor of the call to adventure. So I don't know. I had, as I describe in the book, a distanced interest in psychedelics. I had heard people talk about this, and I knew people organizing ceremonies that I invited to give lectures at the university to talk about the science of psychedelics. But I never felt the slightest inclination to try these substances myself. And then the night after the decision to break up, I sent this email to the retreat organizer saying, I want to participate in a mescaline retreat and an ayahuasca retreat because I need advice. So it was really coming from an urge to find a new meaning or direction in life. Retrospectively, I also think this search was very much triggered by my religious upbringing. So I also describe in the book that I grew up in this Pentecostal church where everything was predetermined. My whole life was being part of that church. And that provides a very strong sense of direction in life. And then when I was a student, I quit my belonging to that church. I quit my faith. And that triggered an existential search process for meaning. And I think my initial inclination to search in psychedelic retreats was very much also inspired by looking for what I've lost in my childhood, or what I found in my childhood, but what I lost when I grew up. And the comforting aspects of the rituals, the music, and some kind of shamanistic belief system that is presented to you that can also provide a strong direction of meaning and purpose. So indeed, that was a very strong quest for adventure at that time.
Great. So the first step kind of qualifies. Then the next step we have is the meeting of the mentor. And I feel that this is a good point where we can highlight the visual aspects of a psychedelic experience. And then it's good to categorize the visual aspects as creative and uncreative. So uncreative is typically something where we see adaptations of the day-to-day reality, changing in color, enhancement, more depth into the visuals, but also tracers, something that's known as tracers. And yet the creative ones are typically associated with hallucinations or geometrical shapes, so hyperspace or seeing geometry. And specifically the part about the creative and representational category is the interesting part for me, because this is where we are speaking about meeting an entity, meeting an animal, meeting a guide, and it's also worth to highlight that it's not for everybody that they will see something. Some people are suffering from aphantasia or aphantasia, I'm not sure what's the right pronunciation for it is, which is actually inability to visualize. But for them, the plant medicine tends to speak through the consciousness of the medicine. So typically you would hear people say, oh, Iboga is the father, or Mother Ayahuasca, or psilocybin is the brother or the sibling or the sister. So then either you have the visual aspect or the consciousness sensational element of that type of entity. And in your book, you also described that there was a raven, and the raven came to you as a mentor, and he sat on your shoulder. Now, I'm curious, is the raven still on your shoulder these days?
No, I think that was a very personal and deep experience at that time, but I haven't encountered it ever since in ayahuasca experiences. But also every experience is so different, and indeed, some experiences can be strongly visual, but one of the most powerful experiences that I've had with psychedelics, and one also I think of the most powerful psychedelics, is a 5-MeO-DMT experience, where you inhale the 5-MeO-DMT and there's no visual aspect at all. It's for me it felt like a nuclear blast, as if something exploded in my head and I was bombarded to outer space and ended up in a complete void. It was just a void, and there was not even a me. It was complete absence. Experience that was as bizarre as I could imagine. It really, and I thought I had already quite powerful experiences with ayahuasca, but this was next level. And
Bufalvarus?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, one of those experiences. And that experience actually was completely devoid of any visual content, but in terms of transformative effects, much more powerful, I would say, than any of the other experiences that had strong visual impact. And it took me quite a long time to actually come to terms with that experience and to also be able to verbalize what I learned from it. So one of the insights I gained maybe 2-3 months after the experience is that I was less afraid to die, even though I was never before aware of the fact that I would be afraid to die. But after that experience, I felt like if I would have to die, I know what it will be like to go through that experience. And that experience has declined or actually reduced my death anxiety or end-of-life anxiety.
For me, it actually has done the opposite. So I had a Bufalvarus experience, and the outcome of that is that I fell into the deepest existential crisis eventually afterwards.
Oh, really?
Because becoming oneness and one with all there is and having all the thoughts at once, that's how it felt for me. It's like blasted into outer space. Suddenly you become one with everything. You're everything. It's not even comparable that you're the plant, or it's such an intense sensation that I felt being allness or being wholeness also means being one. Being one means being alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that sensation of solitude and loneliness, that's what I took out of it. So somehow it was so difficult to rid myself of that. It took me, I think, a year to overcome it.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it can go many different ways.
Very many different ways. And that's why I am a bit of more of a proponent of psychedelics that take a longer time and require a bit more integration. It gives you more space to understand what you're experiencing, because that for me was way too fast and way too intense. So I'm not saying it's for everybody. People have, Joe Rogan is known to be a big fan of Bufalvarus. So for some people it's very compatible. For me that was too fast and too intense. So it can go either way. But again, it also speaks to the need for some people to have more time for the integration and understanding of what they're experiencing.
Yeah, definitely. But coming back to your question about the raven and the second step, the mentor. So I think indeed having a good facilitator or guide or shaman that guides you through psychedelic experiences in the initial stages is very important. And that's also why I think I gained a lot from participating in the retreats, where you have this highly structured setting. There's this person in charge who guides you through the whole psychedelic journey that you make. But I think over time, I think it's also important to educate people about how they can responsibly use psychedelics and become their own mentor, so to say, and how you can navigate your own experiences. And that's also what we're talking about today. So in the initial stages, it's indeed, I think, crucial that someone helps you to get through. But then eventually there are some lessons to be learned, and you can also become your own mentor in a way, your own guru. Because there's also a risk with any guidance. I don't know if you know Professor André van der Braak. He is an ayahuasca scholar in the Netherlands, and he has done a lot of research on Santo Daime and written a book about liquid divinity recently. But he also tells his story where he fell completely for one specific guru, and he was almost brainwashed for 10 years when he immersed himself in this. So there's also this risk of trusting too much in a mentor and then actually finding out that you can also be your own guide.
Yeah, this is why I prefer, for example, the opvolger or the follower or the cousin of hypnotherapy versus hypnotherapy itself, which is an Ericksonian model. And the cousin is generative trance, and it uses Socratic methods. And Socratic methods is not about telling you what to do, but helping you reach your own conclusions or come into contact with your trance. In your trance states, you come into contact with part of yourself that were unconscious, and then you bring them to the surface. So it's kind of similar to the altered state, and then the notion of being your own guru, being your own mentor, and capable to do so. And yet before we get to that space, in the beginning stages, I heard Anne and Sasha Shulgin speak about the fact that it is essential to have an encounter with the shadow aspect of yourself. And usually the shadow aspect will come to you in the form, so in an altered state of consciousness, would come to you in the form of an animal. Panther is very known, jaguar is a very known one. Some people see octopuses, and you saw the raven. And I was wondering, while playing with the idea, well, what if the specific, because of course they are archetypal, all these images, and what if a specific type of animal would have some kind of analogy for you in representing something about yourself in that moment in time? Because why do you get the raven and I get, for example, an octopus, where I get a panther, right? So what makes us different? Why don't we get the same type of mentor? So that was an interesting element. So I took the liberty to looking up, what do Jungian psychologists say about the raven? Do you mind if I share?
I'm curious. Let me know.
So first of all, it is known that the raven is like one of the most intelligent birds, they say, because it is even sometimes considered to be more intelligent than the mammals that we consider to be intelligent, so such as the cats or the monkeys. They tend to live in tightly knit family groups, so they like their family. They like to bond and mate for life. They have a very complex way to externalize and vocalize their communication in very specific way. And they're often associated with having a very troubling sense of humor. Also, the raven is portrayed as a trickster in myths. And in alchemy, it is considered to be the symbol of negredo. And negredo is the starting phase of a psychological development. So it is the downfall or the dark side or the ego death or the, there's another element that I'm forgetting. I forgot what it's called. But it's the stage of darkness before the dawn. So just before you break through and you have this moment of illumination. So basically it brings with it the hope of, enlightenment is near. Also, Jungians considered it to be the dark side of the psyche. And you were just at the beginning stages of your exploration at that moment in time. The raven came to you as the mentor. How do you feel this description fits the moment or the type of experiences you were having in your day-to-day life then?
Yeah, I find it interesting, but at the same time, I'm skeptical. If I bring in my science perspective, if you look at the literature on dream research, there's a lot of interpretation about the symbols that happen in dreams. But to be honest, it doesn't have any solid scientific basis. There's a lot of speculation and theory, but no consistent empirical findings have emerged out of that. And I'm also a bit concerned here that, of course, we encounter these animals in ayahuasca experience, and then we can look up what it might actually mean. But there's a lot of like projection or the danger that we're reading in things that are just random accidents. And that's how I actually view it. Looking back at that bird experience, I think I was primed by the biblical story of the prophet Elijah, and who was being fed by the raven. So that is a story that I learned as a child, and in which this bird had a very prominent role.
It was a nurturing role, so it was
exactly.
positive.
And I think the ayahuasca retreat actually reminded me of that religious setting and might have primed the concept, and then combined with the feathers that were being used to make noise all the time, that already triggered a bird experience. And actually a colleague whom I met at that retreat, I describe it in the book as well, also had a bird experience. And then we were reflecting, obviously you hear all these bird sounds, and then the thing your brain conjures up is a bird-like experience. But at the same time, I mean, I'm skeptical, but I also find it intriguing. I'm now reading Benny Shannon's book, Antipodes of the Mind, in which he's charting the phenomenology of ayahuasca experiences. He's a cognitive psychologist, and he has participated in more than 250 ayahuasca ceremonies himself, and he has interviewed more than 200 people about their experiences. So it's a really comprehensive review of what people encounter, and then it's really remarkable that these kind of animals keep on popping up in these experiences. But at the same time, of course, people also read about meeting the jaguar, the snake, or the bird, and it also creates this expectation. So that's what I find really intriguing. Is it really something that is triggered by the substance itself, or is it shaped by our expectations?
And there is maybe an indication to a possible answer, and this is where Jung sought refuge in the collective unconscious. And specifically, he referred to the times when we lived in caves and we didn't have means of transportation or telephonation or calling each other or communication throughout the world. And yet what they found, in all those caves where people around the world lived at those times where there was no light, they found symbolical representations on the walls that were similar. So they wondered, well, how come a person in Africa is drawing the same type of cow, which they didn't have at the time, the same type of head of a cow, as those in South America. And the conclusion that they came to is that basically when you're spending about 3 days or 2 days in the dark, DMT starts to be released in your brain, and therefore that creates a certain altered state. And in that altered state, we're accessing an collective consciousness. And from that collective consciousness, we start to kind of draw symbols, and that's why they were drawing those specific symbols, and that's why they were similar without having had the ability to travel and speak to each other. So there is some kind of like validity to that. And again, we have DMT being part of the whole deal, right? So
yeah, although I find those theories very interesting, but they're also highly speculative, and they're not often grounded in like solid empirical evidence. So for instance, indeed, DMT has been found in the human body, but I think the endogenous release of DMT in the brain has never been shown in humans that actually happens. It's all based on jumping to conclusions and indirect inferences. It might be the case, but we lack data to actually...
Interesting. So what happens in those dark retreats, did they call them? When you go 7 days into underground?
Yeah, of course you start to hallucinate, but I think that's mostly related to the lack of sensory inputs, because we typically, our brain is a prediction machine. That's the way how contemporary neuroscience views it. So we try to predict what we see, what we hear, etc. And when our senses are deprived, our brain still tries to predict and starts to make predictions that are not grounded actually anymore in any basis, because there's a lack of grounding, and that's when hallucinations happen. So many people who are sensory deprived, so they go, for instance, on a silent meditation retreats for 2 weeks, they start to have auditory verbal hallucinations. So they start hearing voices literally outside their head, because that's what their brain starts generating, these spontaneous hallucinations.
Yeah, and now we're still in the second part of our journey, so the second stage, which is where we're meeting the mentor. And I would also like to highlight the active role of the participant with the meeting the mentor, because the reason I'm bringing up my latest, and I keep referring to that one with the PhD degree quest, latest psychedelic experience with the psilocybin, is because it has all these elements that I find relatable. And in this specific situation, the mentor wasn't showing up. So psilocybin, typically when I take it, within half an hour, I'm already conversing with some kind of consciousness. And for me, it feels like a smarter part of myself that talks to me back. And now it was silent, and I was in complete darkness and in complete not knowingness. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because when, again, it's not about creating expectations, but about opening up the range of possibilities for people to be aware, wait a second, if this happens, then I might also be able to not remain a victim of the circumstance, but take an active approach, which is what I kept doing. So I kept calling in the master, calling in the mentor, and asking her to show up. So then we come to the third stage, which is crossing the threshold. So this is typically known as the stage when you go from basic reality or from the known into the unknown. And referring back to your experience with the raven, he took you through landscapes and cities and countries that you have visited in your waking life. So this is for me the familiar. And he brought an unfamiliar aspect to it, which was lots and lots of gratitude and lots of appreciation for those things. Mm-hmm. Would you say that this is your typical crossing the threshold type of experience in that sense?
Yeah, but again, I would not say it's typical, because this was one particular experience, and every experience is different. And I think I never had any experience ever since like that. But again, reading in Benny Shannon's book, Antipodes of the Mind, I find it remarkable that these flight experiences in which you see cities from a distance are often described in ayahuasca ceremonies. So it is a recurrent theme. And it also fits, of course, with this idea of indeed transcending a certain boundary.
I see a relation here with the neuroscientific concept, and I think we're jumping already immediately into the trials, temptations, and ordeals part, because this is where I was going to bring this up. The flight or transcending or elevating yourself over a certain state of being, for me, kind of, it makes sense, because was it David Nutt, the researcher who researched what happens in the brain when we're taking psychedelics, and that he found that visual cortex gets connected with areas of the brain that usually wouldn't communicate with. Mm-hmm. So that could create that elevated aspect, as in I'm transcending or I'm above the current status quo of my brain. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the symbolic representation of the flying. And our mind tends to speak, or the psyche tends to speak with symbolic representations through dreams. We know that. Mm-hmm. And what you're describing from the ayahuasca experiences. So I was wondering, and if we're stepping into the step of the trials and turbulations and challenges, wouldn't it make sense that if suddenly the brain starts to communicate with parts it didn't communicate with before, that should be associated with some kind of deep sensations and deep emotional, maybe sometimes even pain? So wouldn't that be kind of the reason people are experiencing those emotions? Because it's ayahuasca and psychedelic experiences are associated typically with intense emotional states.
Yeah, but I think it's good to be skeptical of
That's why I invited you.
of those findings, because indeed this is one of the stories that is almost like an urban myth, that your brain starts to make new connections in the psychedelics.
Okay.
That you have these nice brain pictures as well, right? So you have your brain on psilocybin, where everything is more connected, and your brain in the placebo, where there's no connections between brain areas that are normally not communicating. But what happens when you take a psychedelic is psychedelics do a lot, and they also contract your blood vessels. So they have vasoconstrictive properties. And as a consequence, what happens in the brain, in your brain, there are a lot of tiny blood vessels that are all contracting. And what you measure with those brain scans is basically oxygenation in those blood vessels. And then what you see in those brain scans is that if all blood vessels start doing the same thing, then it might seem as if everything is becoming more connected. But what you're actually measuring is simply oxygenation or a bloodstream in the brain.
Super.
So, and you can control for that. And if you control for that, you get a completely different picture that is not showing that your brain is more connected, but that actually there's more sensory information coming in. So everything is perceived to be more intense, including your bodily signals, your visual signals. Everything is kind of amplified. So depending on this physiological artifact, and if you control for that in those brain scans, you get either the story, everything is more connected to everything, or there's just amplification of sensory and emotional processing. And we don't know what is actually the truth in neuroscience. But I think it's really obvious. I think, indeed, many of those early insights that psychedelics work as an unspecific amplifier and they tune up the volume of whatever is already present consciously or unconsciously is still very much true. And in that sense, if you look at the clinical trials that are currently being conducted with psilocybin, people who are depressed and who partake in those trials often have very dark, very depressive, very lonely experiences. It's far from the peak experience that people expect to have. It's not a mystical experience, but people feel even more lonely. They feel even more negative and worse. But going through that experience and learning that you can survive and get through and are not dying of loneliness is already also insightful.
Yeah, and that's why these kind of conversations are important, because then they become kind of a trigger. Wait a second, I heard this before, that I could go through this kind of a challenging or turbulation. Exactly. And right now I'm going through that. So let me remain aware and present with this situation. And I often say the only way out is through. So yeah, in order for us to heal the whatever, burnout, anxiety, depression, PTSD, we need to return back, unfortunately, to that moment where we have been traumatized or where we have experienced it initially. And that's never a pleasant time, usually. Well, in my case, the turbulation with this PhD quest story was that eventually, after hours of begging psilocybin, please talk to me. Why won't you talk to me? Why aren't you showing yourself to me? And for the listeners, it's good to know that in that moment you feel so vulnerable and so exposed, because this is a place which I call home. I usually come into the altered states and I'm like, yes, here we are again. I'm home. I'm received warmly. There's love. There's unity. There's oneness. It feels really good and familiar. And suddenly you return home and your home is completely barren, cold. There's nobody there waiting for you. So then you feel like, okay, well, they knew I'm coming. So why don't they open the door? And why is it barren when I open it? Therefore, it comes with this sense of, oh my God, I'm being rejected. So, and here I highlight the element of active participation. So this is where I ask, well, please, why won't you speak with me? Where are you? AKA having some kind of an agency over that altered state. Maybe I wasn't deep enough in the process. We don't know. But maybe it is what catalyzed the depth of the process, right? Or the intensity of the experience. Also, we don't know. So then suddenly psilocybin, for me, it comes as a she consciousness. It's like a sister. She spoke to me, and I'd like to read it because I made notes of it. And she said to me, well, I'm sorry, but I will not collaborate with you anymore. And the reason for that is because through your search for a PhD degree or for scientific qualifications, you're intending to reduce me to zeros and ones. I am transcendental, and you intend to make me transactional. I am mystical, and you're intending to make me mechanical. I am abstract, and you intend to make me measurable. You mean to explain wholeness by looking into polarities, and you mean to explain oneness with mathematical divisions. So you want to make fluid consciousness into solid data. And basically, she gave me an ultimatum, and she said, if you're going to join the cohorts of those who are trying to make me into a pill, I'm not going to reveal myself to you. So how is it that you are going to find your data from now on? And that was an idea that completely scared me. And I thought, oh my God, but if I cannot communicate with this consciousness and I cannot dive into these explorations, what kind of information am I able to bring into, what kind of quality of content can I bring into scientific research? And this is an interesting notion, because I spoke to scientific researchers, the researchers eventually after that psychedelic trip. And what struck me is that I asked, well, how are you going to conduct your research? And she said, well, it's desk research. And I thought, what do you mean? Well, I will look into previous data that's there and previous science, and I'll just do a desk research. And that for me was like, okay, well, it's like speaking about sober look at psychedelics. You cannot be sober when you're looking into psychedelics. So that's a kind of similar analogy. Well, how can you speak about psychedelics when you're not having the experience? But obviously you can.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do with it. I think another metaphor that I read is that how can you teach someone to swim if you've never swam yourself in a swimming pool?
Yeah.
But I mean, as a scientist, not every scientist is actually teaching people how they should use psychedelics. So I don't know if it is necessary for everyone to have those experiences.
Good
but
point.
in order to really understand what it feels like to be in a swimming pool, you need to have been there. And it definitely helps to give you that first person insight. Yeah. Yeah, if I can say one more thing about what you just described. So meeting with a kind of guide or spirit that provides advice in these experiences, I always find that intriguing. And as a scientist, I try to understand what's going on there, because in like a reductionist materialist framework, I don't really think that we meet those entities, but it's kind of our inner voice that we're engaging in this inner dialogue with. So, and I think with practice, you can also have more vivid experiences like that over time. So that is my view on this. But I also think other people would be inclined to actually acknowledge that it might be the case that psilocybin might have an agency of its own. So again, André van der Braak is this professor that has studied ayahuasca, and he always talks about Bruno Latour's actor network theory, in which you basically try to provide a different perspective instead of the anthropomorphic perspective that we have as humans, or anthropocentric perspective where we put ourselves in the center of science and of the world. Actor network theory actually also allows the possibility that pharmacological substances such as psilocybin might also be an actor in this dynamic network and could also be attributed agency. So that would be an alternative way of viewing this. But I also think, and maybe that's also good to share, that it depends also a lot, of course, on what you want to get out of those experiences. And in the current discourse, there's a lot of emphasis on like this very serious approach in terms of like getting advice from a mentor or gaining new insights in this quest for meaning, etc. But at the same time, I think it's also important to distinguish different uses of psychedelics. So you have the religious use of psychedelics in a traditional ceremony. You have the medical therapeutic use for self-development, for gaining insight. But I would also say there's room for what I would say the recreational use of psychedelics. It can also be just good fun, taking those substances and having experiences that are weird and that are beyond anything we've ever experienced. But that are a bit more lighter than those very deep experiences in which we aim to gain meaning or gain insight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I heard you speak about having an experience at a festival with taking psychedelics. So that's also something I'm familiar with. Like I'm, for example, not very a proponent of chemical substances such as MDMA or LSD. I consider those synthesized. I have nothing against that. And I know there's a lot of research about it. But when it comes to my personal engagement with substances, then it would be always a natural plant in that case that I would prefer. So yeah, I have some experiences with psilocybin in a setting where we are in a club or in a festival like Lowlands, and how enchanting that experience can be in and of itself. But then indeed, this is not a moment when you're waiting for the mentor to show up or the raven to come and to say, hey, let me show you the depth of your unconscious mind. And let's go through ego death. Which brings me to the next step on our journey, which is the descent called in the hero's journey. And the descent is typically when we're confronting the shadow or confronting our difficulties. And we spoke about it earlier in the sense that the only way out is through. So we would have to face our difficulties in order to process them. But there's also something that we are considering that is well known as the ego death. And there's lots of fear related to that. And I heard you speak about terror management. What is terror management?
Terror management is a term that was that is referring to basically a very old philosophical idea, which is that as humans we have a very deep anxiety that life is not endless, and that at a certain point in life we will die. And terror management theory is a theory that has gained ground in science and specifically in social psychology, that basically states that we have developed all kinds of defense mechanisms to cope with that death anxiety. So, for instance, religious belief systems or cultural worldviews buffer us against the anxiety that ultimately we will die. So we cannot cope with that ultimate threat because in the face that we will ultimately die, everything loses meaning. And that's why we build cultural systems, belief systems, worldviews to cope, to keep that fear at bay. But at certain points, we can become aware indeed of that anxiety, and that's when we are basically more vulnerable to all the defense mechanisms that have evolved to cope with that.
So religion is a coping mechanism.
That's what it basically states.
Interesting. So then that brings me to the research that's lately so much focused on removing the hallucination. Okay, so let's start with the ego death. Ego death involves some kind of hallucination, right? So you're going through very, very deep altered state of consciousness experience. And it's exactly those elements, so the hallucination and the ego death, that for me are making psychedelics so effective. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but I feel that that's the most profound experiences, and actually research supports that. And yet, I'm very fascinated about the trend in research where we're looking to separate the pharma from the hallucination. So basically, the terror management that's going on there is let's remove the bad trip. God forbid we should have a bad trip.
Mm-hmm.
And why are we so afraid of the bad trip? Why isn't it more efficient to teach people how to face their mortality than to invest so much money in trying to remove the actual throwing away the baby with the bathwater, so to speak?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's part of like this like almost financial or corporate tendency to make psychedelic medicine and also healthcare in general as efficient as possible. And if you look at how these psychedelic substances are currently being studied, there's a strong emphasis on the pharmacological properties. So people talk about psychoplastogens, psychedelics propose, or actually foster neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
And from the perspective of people working in that field of psychiatry, all those subjective effects are difficult and cumbersome and difficult to manage. And if you can develop a substance that yields similar properties, but you don't have to wait for 6 hours with 2 therapists being present, that's a much more efficient way of fostering the benefits.
And there's the lack of knowledge in me, so I apologize if I'm saying something totally unscientific and stupid, but what's the point of neuroplasticity if we're just having more neuroplasticity? What is that going to do for us, for our brain?
Yeah, in and of itself, nothing. It opens potentially a window of opportunity. That's the theory that might enable people to learn new healthy habits. That's always in combination with like behavior change programs or therapy that actually helps patients to implement those changes. It's not in and of itself, because otherwise those psychoplastogens become another type of antidepressant. You simply give it's a pill, and from antidepressants we know that they work, but they're very moderately effective, and they have a lot of side effects that are very nasty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the dependency aspect, which is psychedelics usually don't have. I mean, I don't know anybody who's addicted to psychedelics, and antidepressants try to get off of an antidepressant. That's a very cumbersome experience, depending, of course, on what kind of type of medication that you're taking. Also, so many things I want to talk about still, but I'm trying to be mindful of our time here together. And that is I believe it's very important in these topics, especially the ones that are so surrounded by stigma, to be very specific about the vocabulary and the language that we're using in the narratives that we're describing them. And everything I've listened and read from you, and I love that part, is never referring to psychedelics as a drug. And I'm also like, why do they call it drugs and they classify them as drugs? And then they give them some kind of a degree in the classification model in order to define, how dangerous they are. But we are also not calling alternative medicines, we're not calling them drugs, we're not calling them medication because
some people are
subpar.
Yeah.
But generally, the studied ones don't. So they think, alternative, that's hoo-ha. So why are we suddenly taking a plant and we're calling it a drug? Wouldn't it be better to, but okay.
Yeah, it's a very fuzzy category, and actually psychedelic researchers are accused of introducing a different framing, like the term psychedelic or the term medicine, that tries to set the class of psychedelic substances apart from other mind-altering substances that are classified as drugs. I know Carl Hart, who has written this book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, is very keen on that. So he's this professor at Columbia University in New York. He openly talks about him using a lot of mind-altering substances all the time. But he is very opposed to the word psychedelic because that gives the impression that it's a kind of different group of substances that are not drugs.
So what
but
does
the whole nomenclature is very fuzzy, and I indeed prefer the word psychedelic just as a working definition because, but in general, they fit with the general category of drugs. But I mean, even coffee is a drug because it has psychoactive properties. But not many people would be inclined to say that coffee is indeed a drug. So it also depends on, just how you view it. And I think more precise terminology is important. And a drug is any substance with a psychoactive property.
Yeah.
And that includes nicotine, coffee, cannabis, and psychedelic substances as well.
Unfortunately, they fall into that category still.
Alcohol is a drug as well, yeah.
Yeah, that I agree. I agree that alcohol belongs on the list. I'd like the psychedelics to fall into a different category. Ego death, did you ever experience it, and how did that look like for you?
Yeah, I'm not really sure if indeed I know what the term refers to, but I've definitely had experiences in which there was a complete lack of my everyday conscious waking awareness or self-reflection, complete loss of sense of self, which I think many people refer to when they talk about ego death. So a complete experience of losing every ground in reality and being somewhere that I don't know where I ended up retrospectively. Yeah, typical ego deaths that people describe as like being eaten completely or disintegrating totally into the ground or completely eaten by some worms, and it's usually associated with a very horrific sensation. So I guess maybe it has to do with our ability to surrender and let go of control, which you sound like you're very good at. And when you're resisting that, where you have more need for control, when you're more anal about it, so to speak, then that's when you would experience this maybe as more excruciating. But that's just a speculation from my side. Be. I've definitely also, and I think many people encounter that, fear of dying when having taken a psychedelic. I mean, that happens a lot of the time. Also in ayahuasca ceremonies where people think, oh my God, I got too much. I probably will suffer from serotonin syndrome. There's this excess of serotonin in my brain. I will become feverish. I have this flush and now this is the end. And that is, of course, also quite anxiety provoking.
That sounds like a very scientific way of thinking during a psychedelic trip, but probably it's a scientist you're describing right now.
True, but I think, many people who read into the literature will read about serotonin syndrome. So if you combine certain antidepressants with ayahuasca or certain foods with ayahuasca, it might result in an excess of serotonin in your brain, and that can be life-threatening in certain cases. So there's a serious risk there. Yeah. And I know indeed many people who've been in that state, like, oh my God, now I have this. Then they made it through, fortunately.
So sometimes, ignorance is a bliss.
Yeah, yes and no. At the same time, there's a serious risk. So you should be well informed before you partake in those ceremonies. And check if there's certain exclusion criteria that will also apply in the studies that we do at the university, of course. So people cannot take specific medicines or specific food before they participate in those studies. Yeah,
not for nothing they recommend the diet, dieta before psychedelic, with especially with ayahuasca. Even like coffee is not allowed, and red meat. For the people who are watching this and they're thinking, oh great, I'm going to go through a ego death. Timothy Leary in Psychedelic Experience recommends two things. It's important to stay present, stay calm, not try to run away from that experience. So again, this brings us back to there is some kind of agency, or they believe that there was some kind of agency to our ability to have altered states. So then we come to the sixth step, and that's revelation and transformation. would this be the part where we're talking about the ontological shock? So when suddenly our reality is completely changed, we're like, oh, we have this aha moment, we have a breakthrough. Some people become religious after such experiences.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is indeed what we observe in many cases, that people are transformed and we find recurrent patterns. So people in general become more open to believing in supernatural phenomena, that there's more than just the reality we see. Many people also move away from a reductionist view on the mind, that everything is just matter, and that what we perceive consciously is generated by our brain, to a more panpsychist view. So people become convinced after psychedelic experiences that everything is basically consciousness, or consciousness is everywhere. So they move away from like a materialist view to a more idealist view, or panpsychist view, that's more in line with Spinoza's idea that mind, everything is conscious in a way. So that's also something that we see, and that can be considered an ontological shock because it often contrasts with people's prior worldviews. So I've spoken to scientists who grew up in an atheist family and who've always adopted a reductionist view on consciousness, that consciousness is generated by our brain, and that after a psychedelic experience became not completely, but were quite puzzled by the experience they had, and said, well, it's definitely no longer the case that I think those experiences can be reduced to brain activity, because I've seen things that are so real that I cannot explain how that happened. And that is indeed what I also find intriguing about those experiences.
And this is where the element of integration comes in. And this is also the 7th step. And that's where we are now on our hero's psychedelic journey. How do you integrate such an ontological shock? How do you integrate such an experience?
Yeah, I think for that you need to have not only psychologists and psychiatrists and facilitators, but you also need religious people or religious leaders or spiritual leaders, facilitators, that have the know-how about religious worldviews, spiritual worldviews, and how you can give people meaning frameworks for making sense of those experiences. Because that's something that psychologists are often not trained in. Like they have all the tools from psychology to help people to cope with mental illness. Yeah. But they are not specialists in worldviews. And now suddenly people are faced with a dramatic shift in their worldview. And that is something that requires proper guidance. And people can be directed, for instance, to Eastern traditions, Eastern spiritual traditions, Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, contemplative practices. But also I think there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom to be gained from the Western traditions we have, even within Europe, like Christianity and contemplative traditions in the tradition that we are standing on, also in Eastern Orthodox churches. I think there's a lot of attention to mysticism and mystical traditions that you could direct people towards. But that requires a lot of know-how on behalf of the people who guide those patients who've been treated.
Yeah, so the shaman has a critical role.
Yeah.
But am I hearing that you're giving up the idea of a secular psychedelic retreat?
No, not at all. I think for some people, they benefit a lot from this religious spiritual framing, but there's definitely also a big group of people who needs a more down-to-earth or sober approach to psychedelic experiences. And there also are quite a number of people that don't know what an ontological shock even means from a personal point of view. So I've spoken to many people who say, like, I've taken psychedelics many, many times, but I've never experienced an ontological shock. So I think definitely it depends on the personality and people's prior experiences and backgrounds and their upbringing as well.
Okay, so I'm glad the secular retreats are still alive in your mind, because I was quite happy to hear you speak about that, because I had this vision before I started this podcast, and this podcast is actually a revelation of that dream. And that is, I have a longing to be surrounded by people who are, just kind of my soulmates, let's call them that way, for the lack of a better word, kind of my tribe. And that usually means that they should be smarter than me. If I'm putting all of them in one room, these people are all smarter than me. So I should be the stupidest person in the room. That's my desire. And I was hoping that throughout this podcast, as it evolves, the speakers who are coming there, how great would it be that, for example, at my birthday party, which is in a year from now, we would all sit together in one room, engaging in entheogens or take some kind of a substance, whether that's psilocybin or something else, and have a secular type of a psychedelic retreat rather than a birthday party where you're coming over and having a hangover the next day. Having something that is co-creating. I mean, we have examples in history from Jung to Freud, who sat together, and we both of them were known to take psychedelic and other substances, where this type of collaborations can bring incredible innovations or new thinking into the world. So this is my dream for my birthday next year.
Yeah, I love that. And it's already happening to some extent. So we collaborate with a company in Amsterdam who organizes basically magic tea psilocybin parties. We're doing research on site, but they have a very secular approach where they invite a DJ and people can make their own tea with psilocybin truffles. And they can take an extra cup of tea as much as they like. And the whole idea there is to be social, use it in a social setting and have a very secular approach, just enjoying being together in that state of mind, which can facilitate maybe connectedness or empathy, etc.
Yeah, creativity and innovation. Sometimes I was envisioning at some point, well, before the latest elections, that maybe we could bring this into the corporate world where you're looking onto team events or leadership development events with psilocybin. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that part of my vision will have to be put on hold. But if I extend this invitation to you to my birthday party, will you come next year?
I'd love to join. Thanks for the invite.
Awesome.
And also a bit skeptical, of this idea of that psychedelics would be able to transform politics or would make people more.
No, we don't put it in the water.
Climate change. No, unfortunately, no. We will not put it in the water. But if it were only that simple, but there's also this research that's now focusing on right-wing psychedelia. I don't know if you're aware of that.
No.
But it turns out that psychedelics amplify what is already present. So if we're already concerned about the environment, then it will make you even more concerned.
Makes
but
sense.
It also turns out that people who are already quite conservative and have right-wing ideologies are becoming more narcissistic and get almost this messiah's complex that they can save the world by fostering those ideas.
I'm so happy you bring this up because there's this anecdote that people are saying, well, why doesn't Putin take ayahuasca?
Yeah.
And actually, Putin is taking a lot of ayahuasca for quite frequently with the shaman. He has a specific retreat where he goes to in Russia. And it is during an ayahuasca session that he got the idea to invade Ukraine. So, as you say, it enhances who you are. It brings more of who you are rather than making you a totally different person.
Yeah, bizarre.
So careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
In that sense. I have only a couple more questions, which are from our listeners. Soon, do we have still some time?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Perfect. Because I told my tribe, so the Shift Happens community, I told them you're coming. And they were like, great, can we have some questions? So I thought, of course. And one question is, microdosing is just placebo. What are your suggestions of how these effects could be measured better? Is it true that it's placebo? And
well, it's true that science has not been able to show that it is more than a placebo, which doesn't mean it's not doing anything. It's obvious that you take something and it has psychoactive properties, so it must have some downstream effects. Mm. And many people have anecdotal reports that they feel better, more creative, more in the flow, etc. But science has not been able to show objectively that it has those benefits. Mm. It's good to be aware of some of the risks. Like we know that psychedelic substances, specifically psilocybin, actually hamper your attention, decision-making, focus, etc. With increased dosage, those effects become stronger, so they actually are detrimental to performance rather than facilitating performance. I would not recommend anyone taking psilocybin before you're driving a car or whatever, because it will actually hamper your attention. And also, I find it hard to imagine that it would be of benefit for better focus or better performance. Yeah. But I can imagine it makes you more associative. So for more creative processes, it might have a benefit. It's only we haven't been able to measure it in the lab.
Yeah. Even creative processes are difficult to measure themselves. So how do you measure when they are induced or not?
Yeah.
You studied psychedelics for anxiety, which this person finds fascinating. And she'd love to hear about your methodology or interpretation of the causes behind the result.
Yeah, so we did a placebo-controlled microdosing study, and we measured depression and anxiety at certain time points. We did not find any effect of taking psilocybin on depression scores. What we found is that as soon as people start taking something rather than nothing, so if people take a placebo or a microdose, they always feel better. So just doing something already has an effect on your anxiety because you're expecting that you will improve. But the reason why we did not find something was probably because it was a very weird population that we tested here. People were not clinically depressed, so they were already quite low on anxiety in general. So that's why we probably didn't see any symptom improvement after all. They were also a weird population in the sense that they were people who participated in a microdosing workshop voluntarily. And although we asked them to refrain from taking any psychoactive substances during the period of that study, many people reported smoking cannabis on a daily basis or having taken ketamine, MDMA, 2CB or whatever during the last weekend. So those were recreational psychonauts who use these substances a lot. So we cannot exclude that they might have taken other substances in between as well that might have confounded the results.
Makes sense. Then we have the horror stories. Under which conditions do people develop psychosis or disorder after consuming psychedelics?
So most of the literature on psychosis is basically showing that if you have a proneness to psychosis, psychedelics can be a trigger for developing a psychotic episode. But that might have happened irrespectively of taking that psychedelic. Psychedelics are a stressful event because they cause a lot of psychological distress if you take them for the first time, and that can be a trigger for developing a psychosis. So if you have any risk for psychosis, that's a strong contraindication for taking psychedelics. Recent studies are also showing or paying more attention to the adverse effects of psychedelics and actually showing that quite a large group of people, say 20 to 30%, keeps having difficulties of integrating the experience properly and are still struggling at a spiritual level to make sense of the experience, are suffering from increased depression and anxiety after having taken a psychedelic. So it's definitely not a magic bullet, and it's now more attention is being paid to those potentially adverse effects that might linger on after having taken a psychedelic.
Yeah, I agree. Integration, but also like pre-integration. That's something I also am very passionate about. This concludes our session. I do have one question though. My PhD degree quest and the advice of the psychedelic or the mushroom in that case, how does the reductionalist in you explain that? Should I take that to face value or should I just try and apply for a degree?
Well, I think in both cases, irrespective of how you look at it, you can take those ideas and suggestions seriously, right? Whether they originate from the spirit of psilocybin, say, or from your own intuitions. It's reflecting a deeper wish for you to pursue. So I would definitely recommend you to look further into those possibilities. But also ask yourself, what do you hope to get out of it next to the recognition of having a scientific degree? Because to be honest, doing a PhD in the end will require 4 to 6 years of very hard and often boring work of doing data analysis, collecting data, being on your own. It's a very lonely enterprise. You can interact with others, but it's mostly just you sitting behind your computer, and you should question, is that really what you want to achieve and want to do?
Thank you. That's very valuable. A question for our next participant.
What is your favorite method for experiencing an altered state of mind?
Thank you, Michiel. This was so nice to speak with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you for our listeners to staying with us for this long. Until next time, have a good week.